Welcome back to this edition of The Debate on France24, where we've been discussing the consequences of a French NGO's attempt to evacuate over 100 children from Chad. Now, Zoes Ark says the children were Darfurian orphans, but UNICEF and other groups have said the children were from Chad and they do have families. So joining me again to debate the consequences of the case are, in the studio to my left, Francis Perrin, board member at Amnesty International France. To my right, Leonard Vincent, head of the Africa desk at Reporters Without Borders. And on the phone, joining us from The Hague, Hans van Loon, General Secretary at the Hague Conference on Private International Law. Thanks all so much for joining us again. Let's go back to where we left off, and I had just asked Leonard if this attempt by this French NGO, failed attempt, I should say, to evacuate over 100 children to France, they say for the purpose of gaining them foster care in order to save their lives, which they insist were in danger. Will their failed attempt make it more difficult for humanitarian organizations in the area to do their work?
Yes, well, it's going to be very dangerous for the NGOs and for the journalists, for the Westerners to work there. And the humanitarian workers will have to face suspicion, threats, and so it's going to be very difficult to work and dangerous to work, and this is where the consequence is really, really grave for us. And there is also the religious factor, which has to be taken into account. The fact that Westerners have tried to take children from a very remote region of Chad, from which the president is a native, at the border of Sudan, makes it makes the situation very complex, because the imams, the tribe chiefs are still very powerful there, and they will not understand how Westerners can take children from the country and take them out of the nation of Islam and take them to another country, to other parents, to raise them not in the culture in which they are supposed to be raised, and etc. So it's very, very dangerous, and I don't think the NGO, this so-called NGO, has thought about the consequences on the ground.
In that respect. Francis, you agree?
Yes, there are at least three main potential consequences on which we must have a close watch on. First, the people concerned, the members of this NGO, the Spanish crew and the journalists, what will happen to them in the next few hours and days. It's clear that Chad is not a country in which the administration of justice and the conditions of detention are very good, to say the least. And so these are matters of concern for a human rights organization.
Matters of concern. How worried are you about their conditions?
We keep a close watch, because we don't know exactly what will happen, but it's clear that we will remain very vigilant about these two issues, because we know the general human rights situation in Chad, and we know that this situation is not good at all. And of course, in this specific case, the publicity, the information will, we hope, be some kind of protection for these people, but we must certainly be vigilant. Second, the humanitarian people on the ground, and here is, of course, a very grave threat for these people who are not at ease, and we are very concerned about the follow-up for their mission in Chad, in Darfur, and so on. So it's, and as these people help on the ground many people in a very difficult situation, it's of course something which is potentially very grave.
Right.
And third, I would say, to have a more general view, we must not forget that some governments, not only the Chadian government, could try to use this affair and perhaps some others which are not at all linked to this one, to try to criticize the NGOs as a whole. And we know that many repressive governments throughout the world, from Chad to Russia, to take two, and many others, to take two very different examples, are very happy when they have an opportunity to say, look, these NGOs, what they are doing, they say they are helping the population, but in fact they are threatening the interest of the population.
There is a risk.
We must understand that by this they often mean they are threatening the interest of the state.
Okay. Hans van Loon, do you think the description that we heard earlier of humanitarian mercenaries is a fair one in this case?
Well, as I said before, I'm not going to comment on the details of the case. I want to highlight the principles and structures and safeguards that have to be respected. Mm-hmm. And from the stories,
do you have an opinion then on how this case might put the work of other humanitarian organizations and journalists in danger?
Well, it certainly doesn't help, because it looks as if the most basic legal principles and safeguards of international law have not been respected. Mm-hmm. That is never good, because and also to ignore, completely ignore that there is a state of origin which has to give its consent, perhaps prohibits inter-country adoption, is of course not very helpful. Mm-hmm.
We have to realize one thing, and it's that the Chadian government is furious against what happened. Mm-hmm. And it really is dangerous for them, because it's a very disputed zone. And the Chadian government is under heavy pressure from the international community, from inside the government. It is very divided. There is a state of emergency in certain regions of the country, in the north and in the east. So they are really, really angry at what happened. Mm-hmm. So they are going to take measures. That's clear.
They're going to take measures. That's clear. But do you think whatever measures they might take would ever compromise the deployment of EU troops that was agreed to in Chad on the border with Darfur?
Well, the President Déby and President Sarkozy said that they agreed that it wouldn't change anything, mm-hmm. and we will see. I don't know.
Okay, but do you have any doubts that this could be used as a political tool?
The pressure on the Chadian authorities would be too strong, and that they will not be able to take benefit from this very strange case to go back on this issue. But we cannot rule out the fact that perhaps some of them have thought at some time, well, perhaps we could use this in order to reach this goal, but I don't think that it would be possible. And as you said, they are furious, and they say it, and they also try to communicate this feeling to their own population, saying, look at Western NGOs, they want to steal our children and so on. So it's a very dangerous game, mm-hmm. To say the least.
Let me ask Leonard, in the case, of course, you're most familiar with, being that of the journalists that have also been arrested. Tell us about the evidence you know of that they will use in their defense, and why you believe that they will be released based on that.
Well, I hope they will be released, because everything is there for their release. I mean, there is evidence that was released today by Kappa TV, which is the big news agency employing Marc Garmirian, which is one mm-hmm. of the journalists. They released today extracts of the interviews made by Marc the days before the arrest, of the guys of the NGOs who were saying exactly why they were doing this, and that they were completely convinced about the fact that they have to break the law to give justice to these children and everything. I mean, and the journalist interviewing is really aggressive with them, saying that, are you not shocked by what you are doing? Do you know that there are laws? Are you sure that these children are all orphans? And one guy said, well, you cannot be sure 100%, and the journalist shows his own shock. So this is one evidence to show that he is not an accomplice, and he was making a story that was showing the hysteria around the world in which they are living. Right. And the second one is a simple letter from the small press agency for which the photographer who is detained was working, saying that he was sent over there just to take pictures of the operation because he wanted to sell the story, and that's mm-hmm. all. That's basically a clear fact that these two are journalists who were sent over there to cover the story because they thought it was so bizarre that it was worth a look.
As observers. Let me turn to another topic then. These families, the purported foster families that had spent some between 2,000 and 6,000 euros to ensure the flight chartered for these children would be completed, and that they would land at Vatry Airport. It's about 130 kilometers east of Paris. They paid significant amounts of money into this evacuation project. What about them? What are the consequences for these families that one might assume thought they were engaging in a life-saving operation for children of a war, and now maybe are finding out that they were part of what could essentially be an illegal scheme? Hans, do you have an opinion on that? What are the consequences for the families from a legal perspective in this?
That's for French law, basically, to determine that.
This doesn't fall under international law in
French law will certainly be inspired by principles of international law, but in the first place, for French law to
what about from Amnesty International's perspective? Where do these families stand?
The French justice system is now in charge of this part of this affair. So the judge will, of course, investigate and will try to get to the facts, to the real facts. So at this time, at Amnesty International, we have nothing other to comment. We will look, of course, at the follow-up of this investigation.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone think that it's possible that we're hearing most of the testimony we've heard today has been not exactly in favor of this NGO, Zoes Ark? Is there any chance at all, do you think, that these children were indeed in danger and that their evacuation had to take place in such an imminent manner?
I think whatever the situation was, this question of children in zones of conflict is so sensitive, and there are so many experts who work on it, who caution the international community every day that it shouldn't be taken like if it was some sort of a show business operation to heal our conscience, really.
Are there any parallels for this? Any other groups you've seen behave?
No, NGOs have been in trouble in conflict zones. Every time there is a war, NGOs are there to try to heal the wounds and have problems. I mean, in Darfur last year, officials from Doctors Without Borders, MSF, were arrested and charged for spying, allegedly, because they had investigated on the cases of rapes in the refugee camps. But usually it's this kind of conflict is as usual when journalists go in places where they are embarrassing witnesses, they get in trouble. But not specifically like that. We never had, at least in Africa, this kind of radical operations who get caught by local authorities and pose so many problems to either their country of origin or the local country.
It's the same for Amnesty International. You've really never seen a case like this.
We are speaking about the fate of a little more than 100 children. If you are not in the ground at this specific time, it's of course impossible for us to say that there is not one of them or 2 or 5 or 10 who are not in an immediate state of danger. It's not possible for us from here or from London or from other capitals to tell it. But what is sure is that Amnesty is working throughout the world for the respect of international law, and we will never do anything which could, of course, undermine international law.
Okay. We just have a few minutes left. So the situation is what it is at present. These people have been arrested, and these so-called aid workers are now in jail in Chad. Do you expect France, can we expect France, to help them to the furthest extent the French government possibly can? The French government has said they warned them not to do it, but they've also said...
They will give consular assistance, and they will see that justice is done fairly and that they are not ill-treated in prison and so on and so forth. And the French government has made it very clear today that the journalists and the aid workers were completely different cases. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, of course. I mean, that's what Hamayad, the Secretary of State for Human Rights, has said today. France is a good mother, and it will act accordingly.
How accordingly can it act, though? I mean, this is, if the French government has already said this group was warned not to do this, It looks like they've gone ahead and done it anyway.
It's a problem.
They are now in Chadian jurisdiction.
It's a real problem. The first statements by the French authorities were very harsh. Perhaps they had all the reasons and the information in order to speak, as some of them did. But when you look at some of the statements by the French ambassador and so on, and Ramayadeh itself, it seems that after some thinking, it was decided at the highest levels of the state that they were French after all, and of course that France is, as she said, a good mother. But as I said at the beginning, we would urge high officials in France to refrain from some statements which can endanger some
Francis
people.
Perrin, unfortunately, I'm going to have to interrupt you there because we are completely out of time for this edition of The Debate. I'd like to thank our guests all so much for joining us. On the phone from The Hague, Hans van Loon, who's General Secretary at the Hague Conference on Private International Law. Thank you. Leonard Vincent, Head of Africa Desk at Reporters Without Borders. Thank you. And Francis Perrin, their board member at Amnesty International France. That is all for tonight. Another edition of The Debate tomorrow. Do join us then. Bonsoir.